Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's Nonprofit Quarterly Leadership Webinar, Accounting for Equity, Expressing Your Values in the Language of Finance. If you know me at all, you know I'm excited to get back to a finance topic. We have a wide-ranging set of topics that we cover, and all of them are really interrelated, aren't they? Approaching leadership and management with equity at the center and supporting you in the evolution of your organizations and your personal and team practices. And I'm so excited to welcome this group of presenters today. Just a couple of logistics. We do record these sessions, of course, and so in a couple of days, you'll get a recording with the slides, not to worry. We also evaluate our sessions, so we invite you to just stay for 30 seconds after our presenters conclude, and there'll be a very short survey that pops up to provide them and us feedback. And I'm also just want to say a moment before I turn it over to you, if that's okay, that I'm really excited about introducing a relatively new member of the nonprofit and small business infrastructure in Diverge Finance. And you're going to hear more about these three folks and why they created this organization and who they serve in a moment. But I'm an infrastructure geek, like some of you on this call, and I just love the idea that these really experienced people notice something missing in the infrastructure, particularly the finance infrastructure, both in terms of service, but also in terms of who's a member of it, right? And how we're developing future finance leaders, whether they're consultants, practitioners, staff members, who bring an equity perspective to that work. So it's just really exciting. So I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Kurt or to Shetu. Who's going first here?
I'll be going.
Okay, before I do that, if you have been a reader of Nonprofit Quarterly, you also probably recognize Kurt Klotz's name. Say hi, Kurt. Because he's written for Nonprofit Quarterly and presented in our webinar program before. And I asked our team to look up one of his articles, is one of the most read articles of the last several years, certainly in the finance space at Nonprofit Quarterly. And that's the revisioning of nonprofit overhead. And to date, this is a number, Kurt, 27,857 of you have downloaded or read that article online. So if you aren't one of those people, I encourage you to do it. I know a lot has changed, Kurt, and you've co-created Diverge, but that article I'm sure is quite evergreen and helps us rethink our old habits and mindsets about overhead. So I wanted to remind you of that really cool history as well and welcome you again with your co-founders and colleagues here. And I'll turn it over to Shetu.
Thank you, Jane. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good day, wherever you are. My name is Shetu Rose. I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEO of Diverge Finance Cooperative. And we're really excited to actually be here having this conversation with you today about accounting for equity and the different ways we can express our values in the language of finance. But before we get started, I'm going to just we're going to introduce ourselves and give you a brief introduction about Diverge Finance, what we are, who we are, what we're about. I'll start with myself, and Kurt and Luciano can chime in whenever. So my name is, as I said, Shetu Rose. I'm originally from Sierra Leone, West Africa. I started my career in the nonprofit sector and in finance in the UK, and that was over 20 years ago. I've worked for different nonprofit organizations, started from the bottom, worked my way up. I've led different teams in nonprofit and in the education sector as well. And then after my long stint in the UK, I actually moved to Switzerland, where I worked in the humanitarian sector in the finance capacity as well. So that gave me a really good exposure to different cultures, different communities, finance with a different lens, different perspectives. And then I moved to the US about 8 years ago. And since then, I'm based in Minnesota, and I've actually worked at Achieve Minneapolis. I was the director of finance and operations at Achieve Minneapolis, and the VP of finance and operations at Center of Economic Inclusion. And just over a year ago, we started Diverge Finance Cooperative with Kurt and Luciano, and it's been a very exciting and exhilarating journey so far. So I'll turn out to Luciano to introduce himself.
Thanks, Shetu. Hi, I'm Luciano Patino, also a co-founder and currently serving as co-CEO and as an outsourced CFO for a bunch of organizations here in the Twin Cities and some surrounding areas as well. My story is also international. I was raised in the Dominican Republic, born in Miami, but raised in the Dominican Republic, and came back to the States to go to college, kind of bounced around Florida for a while, and then thought, hey, let me go experience the winter. So I came to Minnesota in 2000, thinking that I would be here for 18 months to like finish up my business degree and then head back to sunny South Florida. But here we are 22 years later. I call it the Minnesota whirlpool effect. It's like there seems to be like a force sort of keeping you grounded here. It's a pretty great town. So I'm excited to have kind of stuck around this long. My career started in the IT realm. So I worked at help desks and then doing IT training in for-profit work in the real estate world, and realized that like I was volunteering at nonprofits. I was on the board, I was doing grant review, and that's really where my heart was. So in 2015, shifted over to being an operations person in a nonprofit capacity and found out that what I really loved was finance. And so I went over to Propel Nonprofits to be the IT manager there, where Kurt was my initial boss, actually. And I went there transparently to become a finance person. Like I was going to do the IT, but like I was here surrounded by the finance geeks because I really wanted to absorb that knowledge and to find a way over into that that kind of work. And Propel was really supportive of me in that. I became a loan officer there, and then I was doing that when we decided to launch Diverge Finance. So that's a little bit about me. Kurt, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Luciano. Hi, everyone. Very good to be here. Gene, thanks for the shout out. That article has always been a lot of fun. And I just brought it up again this week in a meeting with, in an onboarding meeting with one of our clients who said something. I won't even mention what they said about overhead. And I sort of said, I don't think you want to get me started on this topic. And so I just sent them a link to that article and said, you might want to go here first before we go further with this conversation. But anyway, very good to be here. I'm really delighted to be here in this one for this topic, accounting for equity, but also with this group of people. I mean, Shatu and Luciano are dear friends and now colleagues in a very special way in the sense that we co-founded Diverge together. And, Shatu will share more about what Diverge is about, but just the fact that we are working as a cooperative, that we work collectively, that we provide financial leadership collectively as well. And trust me, we're a year in, so don't ask us to write the book yet. We're working out a lot of it, but we are having a tremendous amount of fun and finding it very, very, even effective in ways we didn't imagine, and also so far successful at a rate we didn't imagine either. So really very good to be here. We'll all be talking more today. So back to you, Shatu.
Next slide, please, Kurt. So firstly, before I get into introducing who Diverge Finance is, I just want to say this is not a stock photo. This is actually a picture of our staff. It really warms my heart when I look at this picture and see how far we've come just in this short period of time. But Diverge Finance Cooperative is a workers-owned co-op, as Kurt said. We officially started last year. And really the goal of that what brought us together was we each had a passion of bringing more representation and diversity to financial leadership positions. Basically, our goal is to change the face of the traditional CFO. And first, starting in the nonprofit sector here in St. Paul and Minneapolis, in Minnesota. So we do our work as a collective. We work with different nonprofit organizations, and we have a few for-profit organizations that we work with as well, fulfilling CFO positions and also accounting positions. And our aim, equity, we view everything in our culture, what we're trying to establish and nurture and foster is an environment of equity and also a learning environment. So the goal basically is that one day, staff that we're actually bringing along with this journey would actually be confident and able to step into a CFO position, either with us or with any other organization. So that's the goal, and basically change the face of traditional accounting leadership as it is currently. So that's just a brief overview of who we are. Diverge Finance. If you want to know more, we have our website. You can go, but as we go through the slides, we'll definitely refer back to different, to how we operate and what we've learned along the way. And I'll give you more insight into who we are and our values and and how we're pushing this forward. And just before we get started, we have a few polls along the way, and there's going to be a Q&A session. So we're definitely looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions just in response to what we have to say here. But as it says here, expressing your values in the language of finance. I read a quote the other day that just said, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you care about. And that is so true. The things we value the most, it's what makes it into the list of our budget priorities. So then the question then becomes, how much do we value equity and inclusion? And how does that impact our financial decisions? Here are the things we'll be exploring in our presentation today. So the learning objectives from this slide we'll be exploring how equity surfaces in nonprofit financial decisions. We'll be giving examples or different examples or our experience of equity expressed in organization practices and policies, and also rethinking budgeting, compensation, investing, and how we and vendor selection, and even personnel practices. So we have a whole, we have some good content, good conversation here to go through. And next slide, please, Kurt. So accounting and financial decision-making is an equity issue. So looking at this, like the financial decisions that are made, and sometimes these decisions are made at the top of the organization, sometimes at the bottom. They impact the lives of communities and individuals for years to come. We're all working in nonprofit. That's the reason why we get into the work that we get into. We want to change lives. And when you think about it, financial decisions really have a big impact on the lives of individuals and the lives of communities we're impacting. So in the spirit of fairness and with the passion to build and sustain thriving communities, it is important that we focus on how we make those financial decisions. So when we look here, representation, the first question is like, who is deciding? Who is actually making those decisions? How far removed are the decision-making from the work that's actually occurring? Most programs, we have the program managers. I was just in a meeting and today, and we're actually a director's meeting, and we're actually just having the fun where the CEO and joke where the CEO was like, it's interesting how the further you are away from the program, you can't even, it's difficult to articulate what the community wants, you know? So it's so essential that we are actually in conversation and know actually what's happening. And the only way we can do that is actually trusting the frontline workers that we actually put in place, and actually trusting them to make better decisions. And basically, the communities that we're serving, are they driving our budget priorities? You know, a decision making. Do we have enough representation in our leadership structure? Can we honestly say that our organization is really reflecting the community we serve, or are we just perpetuating white saviorism? And these are questions I think that we need to ask ourselves. And when it comes to financial decision making and the impact that can have for generations to come. The next thing is process. How do we decide? Are we ensuring that we having all the voices, the key stakeholders, part of that that decision-making process? Is it a collaborative one? Or is this just a few bunch of leaders in a room making a decision and then imposing it back to the rest of the organization? How does that work in your organization? And it's really good sometimes to actually ask yourself, because there's usually sometimes a tendency, there's time factor, there's so many things that can really push us to like, oh, I can just do this quickly and get this over and done with. But then the impact actually goes way beyond that. Are we taking into consideration the cultures of the participants that will be benefiting from these decisions? Our decision making, again, is it top down or is it bottom up? And then talking about resources, like what can we buy? Usually the people in control making the decisions usually have control over what is purchased, what have decision on the items that's needed for a certain program. They have authority to choose vendors, the style of furniture, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where I see representation intertwining or intersecting so well with this process, because if there is a disconnect between the people making the decision, or there's lack of representation, you will definitely have challenges with the resources you bring back to your community to serve them, because there's going to be a disconnect. Another thing is allocating resources. Can you always tell? You can always tell an organization's commitment, you can tell their focus by just reading their financials. I can tell it's a storybook. You can look at it and see what you're focused on. And so do your mission and vision really aligns with what is actually in your financials? When we talk about most organizations now, the talk is equity, inclusion, DEI, investing in people. Can I see that connection between looking at your financial statement, your personal expense, and your mission and your vision, and to drive this organization to a thriving place? Transparency is another thing. Like, how transparent are we with the staff and key holders, stakeholders, sorry, with the decision making? There's usually, especially for leadership, in my experience, there's always a fear of like, this is financial, we need to keep the information to ourselves. And for me, there's no basis for that, because I find that being transparent with the challenges, and not just the successes, not just saying, oh, we hit our goals, we hit our targets, but also we're struggling to actually meet our target this year. And how can we do this together? I find that being very transparent with those challenges in your plan of surmounting them, or even asking your organization or your leaders in the organization, or program heads in the organization to actually, let's do this together. It affords you as a leader a lot of grace. It also brings a level of shared ownership among staff when it comes to the financial health of the organization. So these are just questions I will actually encourage us to think about when it comes to that decision-making process. And slide 7, the next slide, Kurt. And this is just a reiteration of the previous slide, like who makes financial decision matters, like who's controlling the budget, who's controlling the narrative. I find helping staff understand the levels, the direct and indirect component of their budget gives them a better control and ownership of their budget. So it's all about setting perspective. It's all about setting the right layer of, the right level of trust within the organization. These are all really big decisions. And actually whoever is overseeing or making these decisions, they really should ensure that it's done from a place of equity. Next slide. So this slide is showing a layering of an organization. It shows from the grant, you see how the grant level to project to program department, and then the whole organization. And I'm just looking at this, I'll just encourage you just to think about the impact of having the processes we talked about earlier, representation, the process of actually making a decision, resources, transparency. Just think about having all of these happening at each layer of the organization. Think how big the roll-up, the impact of the roll-up is going to be on the organization as a whole. But then even think about how deep and how far the reach to the communities that we serve is going to be, because everyone's going to be aligned with not just the community. It's not just someone at the top making the decision, but there's a real flow and unison across the department. And I know you all are thinking, like, and some of you might be saying, Shetu, who has time for all this collaboration? There's so much, we don't have time for this. The nonprofit sector, how it works, like we need things done yesterday or last week. And I know it can be quite frustrating at times trying to align your values in time with that grant, and it's a feat, it's a challenge, and it takes a level of strategic planning. But I would really want to encourage you, challenge you to stop and think about your values at that point, when it feels as if we're actually in that hamster wheel trying to get everything done yesterday. Let's stop and think about our values. Think about the org values. the impact of the decisions that you're about to make. How is it going to affect the communities that we're serving? Is this financial decision just a quick fix? Is this a Band-Aid? Is it just going to take you back to, in a few weeks' time, it's going to take you back to where you started from? Or is this a real first step towards sustainable recovery and change? So I'll just leave it there. And I think I'll hand it over to Kurt.
Thanks, Shatu. I just want to say that I'm glad I was muted. I laughed out loud when you said, "Who has time for all this collaboration?" So I was like thinking, well, it's an excellent question, but like who can dare not do it? That's the other question. So yeah, Jean, if you don't mind, we're going to ask you a polling question here. We'd like to know just from you all who it is that might be involved in financial decisions in your organization. This is obviously a multiple choice. You can choose more than one option here, but we'd be glad to hear from you all sort of where those financial decision-making lies in your own organization. So we'll just give you a moment here to consider the options. I got teased maybe a little bit about my enthusiasm for options, but we want you to, there's a lot of people in an organization, so we don't know who's actually involved at yours. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Thanks, Jean, for doing this. And just, we can leave that there for just a second. Now, we didn't actually organize the list to show up with this kind of an obvious hierarchy towards the top, but it sort of makes sense that if those are the folks that we traditionally look to for decision-making, it's not surprising that we include them all. It'd be unusual that the CEO or ED or president isn't somehow involved, right? That's part of their leadership responsibility. But as we get farther down that list, to Shatu's point, it might take a little bit more time to involve people, to collaborate with folks at all these different levels. So great, thank you. Hold on to this idea. We'll revisit it in a different way in a little bit. So, yeah, I want to move on to just a little bit about the origins of this whole idea about one of the ways that we are addressing some of the ideas we're going to present today. The whole idea that equity in financial decision-making starts a lot with who is in the leadership role. And I want to give a huge shout out to Vu Le and what I call stating the obvious. He actually was a keynote speaker at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits annual conference several years ago, probably 2015, 16, something like that. And he gave a great keynote presentation, but it wasn't there that I found the transformational message that he was carrying that day. He and Dominic Washington, who I think might have been at the Bush Foundation at the time, gave a presentation right after, and we're talking about hiring practices. They're just talking, just sort of have a random conversation about equity and hiring practices. And Vu said, well, okay, let's put it this way. So everybody in the world's talking about how, oh, geez, we just can't find a diverse candidate pool, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, yeah, I don't buy it. He said, where are you posting your positions? He's like, and what screening methods are you using to then sort through the responses you get? He said, I'll challenge you to two things: post differently, and then use a different screen. And my guess is you'll have as diverse a pool as you've ever had. Well, I'm not up, I was up for the challenge. I went back to, it was then Nonprofits Assistance Fund where I was working, and said, okay, next time I'm hiring, I'm doing something different. So I did. I posted in 2-year colleges around the Twin Cities, which are my place. If you ever want to have the world you want to live in, go to our Minnesota State University and our college and university system colleges, the 2-year colleges that are feeders to 4-year universities. That world is, if you want diversity, just to see it across the student body, that is such a lovely place to go and hang out and see what's going on there. Well, started posting jobs there. It's because it's not just for those folks who are getting 2-year degrees, but it tends to be a sort of a magnet for new immigrant and emerging immigrant communities. It's really a place to find folks that I wouldn't otherwise have posted when I'm just going to sort of the usual nonprofit, a state association posting board, or, maybe more traditional job posting spots. So we started posting differently, and then we started screening the applications differently. If you start to look past people's degrees, or you start to look past an immigrant person's most current job to the 3 high-level leadership positions they held in their country of origin, and then start, thinking, wait a minute, they may be doing something very entry-level here, and look past that and find out, wow, okay, here's some experience that we don't normally have access to. So we started calling lots of people, and the other thing is we started interviewing lots of people we wouldn't have interviewed in the past, because the because the paper didn't look like we'd been used to seeing it. If you want to think of it that way, the resumes were just different. And sure enough, we had wildly diverse pools of candidates for positions that we hadn't had in the past. And soon enough, we were having more diverse staff. And I realized diversity is not the end, right? I've learned a lot since then, but it was the place we were starting at that point. That mattered to us. We thought it was a value. We didn't really know what that meant, but it did actually start to change the face of our organization. And I'm very proud. I mean, it's not just been my effort. It's across the whole organization that was Nonprofits Assistance Fund and is now Propel Nonprofits. But the staff, there is a very different staff than it used to be in demographics and representation and worldview and outlook and leadership. And so it's really great to see how that transformed an organization. It's only been 7 years, right? Since that and we started changing things, and it really has changed the organization in pretty amazing ways. So the next piece I want to add to this thing about the, financial leadership mostly being a white domain, in the nonprofit world, we like to think we're ahead of this curve. So we always think like, oh, well, we're out hiring differently and we tend to, I hate to say it, but we tend to default to that our diversity comes at entry level. We like to hire there first. And so if you start to look at leadership, it still tends to be predominantly white. And then this is not surprising. MCN, Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, did a CFO survey a few years ago. And in a state where, Minnesota is not particularly diverse if you compare it to the coasts, but it should be about 20% people of color, thanks to some very successful and thriving immigrant communities in the state and long-term communities of color that have been here and developed and grown. So you'd think about 20% of the leadership of organizations would match that. Well, in the finance realm, the MCN CFO survey came back, less than 4% of financial leaders identified as persons of color. And so I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So, in a field that prides itself on being ahead of the curve, when it comes to finance, leadership was very much a white domain. We could also bring in the gender side of that in a field that tends to be, at least in Minnesota, about 75% women as employees or make up the staff of nonprofits. The financial leadership side of this is more than half men, which is also very interesting. So it's like, okay, gender and race involved in the CFO leadership survey. Well, that spurred actually an idea that hatched first when I was at Propel. I actually left Propel in 2018 with this idea, and I give great credit to CLA, which is a very large accounting firm. Many of you have heard. It's a national firm, but they hired me into a new position there as Director of Nonprofit Innovation and allowed me a quarter of my time to work on this idea of how would we attract, support, and advance people of color in financial leadership. I give them credit. They put money behind it. They gave me time. And the first thing we did was convene a group of people from around the Twin Cities who were community leaders, education leaders, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, all persons of color themselves. And we paid them stipends for their time and experience and their value that they would add to this. I want to say that because that is in itself an equity issue. We always love to get people on boards, ask for their volunteer time, and we love to get people of color on our boards. We want diversity, and yet we don't seem to value that in the way that we know what speaks value in our world, which is finance, right? So that we gave people stipends. We gave them a generous stipend to be part of this committee or group. Shatu is actually one of those members, which is very exciting that she's now part of this group together. And we spent about 1.5 years before COVID sort of interrupted our plans to do some envisioning and planning. What would it be to build this support network and or mechanism to support people of color coming into the field? And with that sort of COVID shutdowns and lots of interruptions, it didn't really get started. We thought maybe it was going to be a nonprofit of some kind at some point. Well, after being there for a while and after just sort of realizing my own sort of path on this, I actually reached out to Shatu and Luciano and just said, what if we just went and did this? I think we have enough information. I think we sort of know, what if we chose a different pathway to get here? And that's what was really the spur of Diverge Finance Cooperative. And we talked and met just over 1 year ago, formally launched when we finally decided on a name and also chose cooperative structure for a reason. We realized that, yes, we want to work on financial leadership in a new way. We also know that when you ask people of color to take on leadership roles or to become part of an organization, we also thought that actually owning this sort of venture themselves, becoming worker owners, was going to be a huge part of a huge equity issue in and of itself. So that's our structure. So that's how we came to this place. We're all from the nonprofit world, and yet here we are creating a cooperative structure and sort of instead, but in a way that supports and still is involved in the nonprofit world. So it's been an interesting path too. We're learning a lot from that. So one of the things we've identified, and really we hope that we see this new way of doing things is not just limited to our new cooperative, but we're certainly instilling it in the organizations we work with, is that there is really a problem with seeing leaders as solo artists, right? I mean, many of you on this call, I know Jean's been in this position. There's others of us that have either supported, but the solo leader, the idea of being a leader out in front by yourself, and that can be a CEO, can be a CFO, where you're leading finance on your own. And the problem with this is like, so you get everything, you get all the credit, sure, but you also get all the blame. It's a dangerous position out there all alone. And it can be a very taxing one. It concentrates power. That can be very satisfying ego-wise. It can also be highly disadvantageous when it comes to organizational effectiveness, or frankly, who holds you accountable. Concentrates all the pressure. People can crumble under this. And here's the next part, that in our context, in the context of trying to advance people of color in leadership roles, it begs targeted bias, especially in those organizations that are trying something new, right? Where you have the board is so excited they've hired their first finance leader, program leader, CEO of color, right? And they put someone out, and yet the organization itself isn't built to support them. The board isn't aware of, even culturally competent to support them. And you put somebody out in front, and it's a truly a danger zone. It can be wearing, tiring. It can be all kinds of the worst sides of representation, where people get sort of categorized in that role. So we really wanted to sort of call out that solo leadership isn't as great as it sounds. Now, this is something that I have also learned from my colleagues, Luciano and Chatu. This doesn't in no way is a critique of any person of color who has chosen and is leading in that position. This is a support for them, and not meant to say that this is an inferior way to lead. We're just saying it carries a lot of tension with it. And something that we wanted to try to counteract in the sense of like, how can we build people to become leaders and give them their experience of being leaders for the first time without having to take all of this on at the same time? So collective or other possibilities than the solo artist is sort of the collective leadership model. How could, and to Chatu's point, broad collaboration, which may take a lot of time, but we think it is actually one of the ways to counter this idea of being a solo artist. The idea of sharing authority, and yet holding on to clear accountability. Chatu mentioned in a number of ways, including all those who are affected, all the way down to the community level. This whole idea that there are different ways of doing leadership. It doesn't have to be a solo activity. So when we talk about financial leadership, we're suggesting not only, like, we do lead collectively, even in our cooperative itself. We have the cooperative itself, then we have the way we lead among all the organizations we lead. In both instances, we do it collectively. Cooperatively, we have two co-CEOs. We have a leadership team of the three of us who are founders. We are very excited to say that within a few weeks, we'll have our first member owner, because there's the 12-month period that's pretty standard in the cooperative world. If you're an employee for 12 months and then all of a sudden you're an owner. Very different than the big 8 accounting firm I came from, where ownership was probably a 25 to 30 year path and included, I would guess, a $500,000 to $1 million investment, because it's a $1 billion company. So to become an owner there is almost out of reach. For us, it happens after a year of service. We're very excited about that. But not only at that level, so the leadership level, yes, we'll do that collectively. We'll talk about that as we go on. But also then, how can you actually, for any organization, any nonprofit that's out there, how can you start to involve your whole staff in financial leadership? Chatu started hinting at that. She's going to give some more examples in just a minute. but really wanted to talk about, like, can you start to imagine roles and responsibilities rather than positions and departments? I think we get tied into, like, whatever your title is or the department you're in sort of pigeonholes you, leaves you stuck in a place or limits your involvement. That is the opposite of inclusivity. If you want to talk about inclusion, think about this. This is financial decisions and who gets included in there. And here's a very practical example. And, we are like Jean, I'm happy to hear she's excited about a finance topic today. We are always excited about finance, but we really encourage that to be owned across the organization. It's a powerful, powerful part of our organizations and really key. So now we'll turn to Shatu with some examples of this in a very particular area.
Thanks, Kurt. Yes, and just based on what Kurt just shared, one example of how we collaborate when it comes to financial planning, financial decision making is through budgeting. So I'll just take you through an example of how we do our collaborative budgeting. But really the goal here is really avoid and taking away from this notion that the budgeting should be done on the top. I remember one job I went into, I just entered the job the first time and they told me like, oh, you have to create the annual budget for the year. I was like, I don't create budgets by myself. There's no way I can sit down and create a budget. The program staff need to create the budget. They're the front line. And that was such a shocking thing for the leadership or the CEO at the time. It's like, what? You're the finance, why can't you create the budget? And for me, that's just a principle. And collaborative budgeting is very refreshing. It takes a long time, but then this is where planning comes into it, right? But it avoids hierarchy. It brings more voices into the pool. And believe you me, there is really more opportunity for cross collaboration that one leader cannot think about, right? And just going through, just right now in the middle of a budgeting cycle with the organization and just having conversations with the program staff. And it's just amazing to hear ideas sparking between both different departments or different program leads, like how they're going to collaborate. That can even save you cost, if you think about it, because I know that's what we like, how do we bring the budget down? But collaboration, and it's like, oh yeah, we could do this together. And that is even more effective in our program delivery. So I would really encourage having and being collaborative when it comes, or doing it collectively when it comes to budgeting. And I'll just take you through the next slide that will really just highlight how we do it. And this is just re-emphasizing the point before. Basically, there's no solo artist. You cannot do this alone. It's a shared responsibility. It gives ownership to the staff. And that's something people and leadership sometimes fail to realize. People really guard their budgets. Once they have ownership over it, once they know what's in it, they might even be more protective of spending that budget than you are. That's just the fact. So what more? I think it's a release of tension from leadership to actually empower your staff that are doing the frontline work to own their budgets. And really, all it takes to get them there is really just clear understanding of what budgeting is. And so that's why we have a process of how we do this, and it's very aligned with the mission of the organization, very aligned with the vision of the organization, the strategic plans, and how we're going to get there. The next slide, Kurt. So this is just an example of how Diverge go about collaborative budgeting. So we always start with the strategy. So the first is actually identifying what the strategic priorities are. Usually that's already set in stone. Most organizations have a 5-year strategic plan. And then from there, they develop a work plan. Okay, this is what we're going to do in year 1 or in year 2. Sometimes it's a strategic framework and the shift based on the current environment or financial climate at the time. So it's just working off that. You already have a set strategic priorities in place. And then we set up a session with the staff and then program leaders. And this is, sometimes organizations are really big and it's like, oh, there's a lot of people in my organizations to do this. But this is a 6-month process. We really start, we give ourselves time, a 6-month process, giving the staff time to actually develop their work plans if they don't have any, with their teams, with their supervisors. And then we sit together and then we don't discuss numbers. We just discuss what are your plans for the next year, emphasizing investment opportunities, emphasizing visioning what they see the program looking like. And usually whenever that comes up, I've heard leaders like, oh my goodness, they're just going to go run free reign. Everyone's going to put everything they want in the budget. It's like, yeah, it's fine if they put it in. That doesn't, but at the same time, making a budget brings innovative ideas on the table. And yes, we have to look at the financial, if we can afford it or not, but there is time. You can always delay, you can always push back projects, but at least the ideas are out there, and everyone takes ownership of that because they realize, oh, this is something we plan on doing. We know we don't have funds for it now, but hey, we can actually plan to get this done in next year. How exciting is that, having your program managers actually be part of that strategic process of actually planning out their program for the next 2 years or 3 years. And then we actually, after that, we after working with them with their work plans, then we generate a resource list. So pretty much just listing out all the different resources they need to actually implement their work plans. From that, we go to a draft, coming with a draft expense. We actually have a really good conversation with development, looking at revenue, projections, current year, releases from restriction, and then the conversation where we come to identifying the gaps. And this is where it's not just the leadership that I think should be part of this. I think this is all the program. Looking like we have our draft budget. We've got a $500,000 deficit that we need to plug. Let's do this together. How are we going to do it? Development, program teams, what is necessary for this year that we can focus on? What are our non-negotiables? What are our negotiables? What can we delay? And having everyone into that conversation, I find it's very, very, very exciting to see it unfold. And we obviously, as you can see, we involve the board as well, because we make sure, starting 6 months in advance, we make sure at least the finance committee reviews this process and review the budget twice before it gets to the board for approval. So by the time it gets to that point, everyone, there's an ownership to the budgeting process. There's an ownership to the numbers. And Luciano has a great example of an organization where he mistakenly sent a budget out with numbers, with the wrong numbers, and his staff contacting is like, this is not the numbers I put in my budget, send me back my real budget. And it's just great to see because they've taken ownership of their budget. So yeah, so that's the next slide. And I think, Kurt, that's you. Yeah.
Thanks, Shatu. Well, I've been laughing out loud a lot on my side of the mute button. That's a great story from Luciano. So this is a trick question. We're going to post a poll to find out who in your organization is actually involved in your budgeting process. And these may look vaguely familiar to you, and they certainly tie to the earlier question, but just want to see if it and for you to consider, does this line up with your earlier response? Are there any nuances you're realizing between what you answered first and now? But just take a look at this.
In your defense, Kurt, all items have gotten at least one vote. So if that rationalizes this extensive set of options, then as it certainly does, it's a full data set. All right, I'm going to end the poll here. 1 second. Oh, I still see some people picking. All right.
Interesting. So, I mean, it is not surprisingly fairly similar spread, but there's actually a few more folks in the finance and accounting staff and the program and department staff that are involved in budgeting. And what's interesting about that, the reason I said it's a trick question is because I think many of you would decide that like we could put 3 or 4 organizations together, and the idea of who's deciding or making actual, in control of financial decisions and who's working on the budget, they're not always aligned. sometimes we're asking people to work on the budget without actually giving them any sort of authority or decision making in it. Like we want their input or we want them to go run the numbers, but we haven't actually given them the whole responsibility or actually the agency to do anything about it. So that's why we sort of wanted to include what seems like the same set. Well, I just answered that. Well, not quite. It's a little different thing, and just wanted to make sure we looked at that. So.
And there's a nice couple reminders in the Q&A that development plays a key role in the revenue projection. So they called that out specifically, which is a good collaborative effort, I assume.
Yeah, and I'm actually, what's interesting to me is that I'm actually sort of embarrassed I don't have it on my long list.
It's okay. We definitely consult with development teams. We promise.
Yes.
You. Yeah, definitely a large part of the process is figuring out where the revenue is going to come from. Maybe we can move on to Q&A. I want to elevate some of these comments that have come in through the Q&A panel, especially if there are some folks who can only interact via audio. Just a couple of these that I think are really interesting. Well, we have some folks who are doing cooperative work, either as an entire organization or through leadership, which is really cool. Like we've already mentioned, there are other ways to do things other than single leader, and there are really good reasons to try it. And I've seen it implemented well and not well, so it's not like a panacea or the only way or the best way, but it's just that there should be more options, right, out there than sort of single leader type work. A comment from Wing Lee about the fact that finances or the way that we run finances are by definition extractive. It's about, like, when we look at a balance sheet, there are some words and then there are dollars on numbers, and that's all we get, right? We don't get all of the different kinds of value or all of the different ways to see objects or things in the world that aren't as westernized, right? Or aren't as rooted in white culture or white supremacy. And so if we think about so many cultures that treat the land as spiritual, right? Or resources in nature as things to be protected, not things to be extracted, right? Those are really, really great and important points. And we should have methods and ways to calculate that value or to store that value, to honor that value, right? Beyond simply a balance sheet and a statement of activities, right? Like there's more to the things that we do in the world than that. So I think it's a really great point, and something for us all to consider. And then this idea of sort of split leadership or being a way to reduce the risk of fraud and embezzlement. I think about the Bernie Madoff scandal and how if you wanted a document from them, you have to call upstairs, right? Because there were only 2 or 3 people who were allowed to prepare statements or to see the numbers, because that's what you need if you're going to embezzle money or steal money. You don't want anybody else looking at what's going on. So actually, we believe that visibility, although not necessarily power to maybe pay things or sign for things or ACH things, but the power to be able to see what's happening in your financial statements by multiple people reduces the risk of fraud, because it's more likely that somebody will see a nefarious activity and point it out.
I'd also like to lift up this tension that one person raised, but I think is really widespread, is when you begin to make this transition to engaging and collaborating, especially with programmatic staff or administrative staff who haven't been proximate to the numbers in previous administrations of the organization, you do also encounter resistance. It isn't only just, oh, joy, we finally get to participate, right? There can be ambivalence or even flat out resistance that this isn't my job, it's not my training, and so I've certainly worked with CFOs who get excited about what you're modeling and then get really hurt, and really is the word, that their offerings of inclusion are not warmly accepted. And of course, there's a lot of organizational systemic issues and trust issues, et cetera. But if any of you would like to comment on that, I think it's an important point that this isn't a straight line.
I'll jump in with a quick, even in our short history, I'm going through the 2nd year of our collaborative budgeting process with one organization. And the difference between the first year and this year is tremendous in the fact that the program department leaders they know what's coming and they were ready, but the first year there was a mixture of fear of this is, collaboration takes way too much time. this isn't my job. Oh, you're sure you're going to ask me all about these things, but it doesn't matter because somebody else is going to decide it anyway. But we went through all of that. And this year, I mean, once they actually learned that, oh, wow, it really did work. And they actually, they are actually, using budgets they helped create last year. This year, the enthusiasm for it was way different and a lot quicker. I loved it on that side.
Yeah.
So the collaboration can get more efficient.
Yeah, one of the things we have to do as leaders, I hear you saying, is we got to remember that it's not going to be a straight line. And the thing about budgeting is you do it in these cycles, and then as people have said in the Q&A, hopefully you have time for quarterly updates. And so there's these periodic chances to take another step and another step towards building trust and fluency, et cetera. So thanks for that. Do you want to?
I'll answer one or two more questions, but then we'll move on. If we'll leave these up, so if we have more time to answer questions later, we can take care of them. There's some questions here about, there's a question about software and about if you have a software. We use Excel spreadsheets. We think of the way that we budget and the way that we allocate expenses. We haven't found anything that's like a tool that's ready-made that's great for nonprofits to use. We could certainly share some templates that might be useful with some sort of baselines where we should show some allocation numbers. For those of you who are really into spreadsheeting and formulas and finance minded, those might be useful for you. But there's also comments here about some folks about the not my jobism or I'm not the finance person. That's important too. I think that it doesn't have to be about the numbers. And for a lot of folks, we don't make it about the numbers at all, right? We make it about a work plan and resources. It's like, what is your dream for next year? And what do you need to accomplish that? And we ask them in those terms so that then we can go back and enter numbers into our spreadsheet and figure out where the revenues and expenses land. But for most folks who don't think the way we do in terms of how it's going to show up on an accounting software, right? We ask for work plans and resources, and that tends to bring people along because they do know what their work is and what they'd like their work to look like.
And there's one question there regarding just what you just spoke about. It's like example of what a work plan might be for an organization that's just starting a finance department. So basically the work plan it's usually based on the program. So what exactly are the programs? What's your vision for next year? What do you plan in doing? For example, obviously the organization must already have a mission, a vision. What do you do every year? Is it a food shelf you run? Is it this advocacy program? What is it? And listing those, and the work plan is pretty much just listing down how you're going to get your work done in that year. For a finance department, just starting a finance department, and it starts from even like the staff. Like I need this amount of staff to staff my department. I need a finance software. I need to get and I need to get training, professional development for my staff. Is just listing down what exactly are the different, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve for next year? And then listing down your resource list. So this could be, for finance department is mainly most time, obviously that's part of the administrative cost, but for programs, it's actually the direct work that they do in the community.
All right, Kurt, can you bring us to the next slide, please? Thank you. So as Shatu mentioned earlier in the presentation as well, the way that your financials tell a story, right? And that story shares your values or what you have prioritized for a particular time, for overtime, right? All of those things show up in your financial statements. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. So there's lots of different ways in which the way that you prepare your financial statements or the things that show up in your financial statements show up. For example, who the decision makers are, right? Like have you, like we've mentioned before, like who's in charge of your budgeting process or who have you included? Not only who have you included, but who gets to make final decisions, right? About certain aspects. So for example, when we work plan with program staff, we ask them for priorities. And we ask them to tell us, like, what are the things that if we need to cut something from this budget, where should we cut from first, right? Eventually, we're gonna end up with a budget that will tell us whether we have enough revenue to support all of the work we'd like to do. And we usually have to cut something on the expense side. And when we do, we want feedback from the program staff about what's most important to them, because they're the ones closest, right, to the actual work. Have you invested in DEI training in general, specifically for leadership? Is the board included? Is the board not included? Because we often want to get to a place of diversity, but have not prepared an environment where people of color can actually succeed, right? Or where they can be themselves, where they don't have to come in and adapt, right? Some people of color can succeed because they're good at adapting and others aren't, right? But we want everyone to have the opportunity to succeed. And that requires organizational culture work in order to make sure that you've set things up correctly for that to happen. Compensation policies. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but definitely what kinds of benefits are you offering? Is it just traditional benefits that of healthcare, medical, vision? Are you providing for people's retirement? Are you not? And those are really key and important values, but also are things that make you more or less competitive, right? When folks are deciding where to work, especially in a hiring environment, the way that we have it today. Personnel policies about leave and benefit structures. Leave is a really big topic, something that I learned when I worked at Propel, where we established a really flexible leave policy that centered employee wellness over anything else, right? So there was none of this situation where after 3 years you earn an extra week of time off, or after 5 weeks, or after 5 years you earn another week of time off. If the goal of time off is for people to take time off to be rested, to be well, everybody should get the same amount of leave from the beginning, right? Or the idea that certain holidays are more important than others, or are the standard holidays for an organization. We establish policies where actually everybody gets to choose the holidays that they want, and we just give them those days at the beginning of the year. Something that we've done similarly at Diverge, where people get holiday time on January 1st that they can use however they want. Vendor representation is really important. Are you centering local businesses, businesses owned by women, businesses owned by queer folks, BIPOC-owned businesses? Those things can totally change the fabric of a community, right? If people are investing in their small business owners who have often been overlooked or underestimated, being a leader in investing in those businesses not only means that you're giving them your business, but also probably that you're able to recommend, that you're able to increase their business by allowing them to survive longer, right? Especially with during pandemic times or times of high inflation, or all of these different struggles that we've had these last few years. And then investment practices. We spend a lot of time with our partners talking about their investment policies and their investment choices. And we definitely think that ESG type investments are an improvement over investing in certain kinds of companies that don't fit our values, right? We don't want to be invested in companies that are actively working against our mission. However, there are even better ways, we think, of investing in our local communities. There are all kinds of funds available all over the country where you can invest specifically in your area. You can invest specifically in a kind of work, right? Especially if you're a little bit less worried about having a 7 or 8% return, but you're willing to get something that's a little bit closer to sort of fixed asset class. If you're willing to invest in housing, right, or in other kinds of, in small businesses, right, in minority-owned businesses, there are funds that are set up that you can use your endowments, your reserves, but you can invest in those areas locally, and you get a better return, a much better return than you would having it sitting in a savings account, but is actually powering your mission and furthering your mission with dollars that you normally would just have sitting in a bank or in stocks. So all of these different ways of thinking about your finances from a mission perspective are really powerful. Let's go on to the next slide. And this is just to sort of to nail home the point, right? That there are all sorts of ways, obvious and less obvious, for us to invest in equity and justice and to do it consistently year over year, that will have an impact both on the mission and the work of the organization that we're doing, and on our most important community, which is our staff. Go on.
Luciano,
Yeah.
Luciano, there's a couple of questions about vendor selection, and since you did pull that out as an example, do you want, I see that you use the word policy there, though it was a little p. Can you speak a little to what you've seen folks do to ratchet up attention in that area?
Yeah, so one of the ones that I've liked the most was at MCF. When I worked at the Minnesota Council on Foundations, we had a multiple point kind of a scoring system, right? Where we decided, where we would have, so is the business BIPOC or women-led? Is the business local? And if you kind of hit on 2 or 3 categories, or in all 3 categories, that was our preferred vendor type. And then we had sort of like, if you hit on 2 of the 3 categories, then that was our next preferred vendor type. And we then, on top of that, set goals around how many sort of fully preferred vendors we wanted. So if it was, I think at the time it was like at least 50% of our vendors are BIPOC owned, local, et cetera. And then at least another 30% are sort of in that next category. So it's both important to have some idea of what it means to you to have, to be advancing like local owned businesses or BIPOC owned businesses, but also then to set goals and to track against those goals so that you
Feels like a great DEI activity for staff also to, to come up with that scoring system, as well as to source vendors. Because a lot of times we use those vendors in our personal life, right? And we've never been asked, who do you think we should use for sandwiches or for facilitation or what have you, whatever those vendors are. Thanks for that. I love the idea of a scoring system that's co-created by the staff.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Go ahead to the next slide, Kurt. Thanks. This is an example of how the values that we have are on a continuum, and we can always be looking for ways to improve on what we have been doing, right? The very least that we can ask for is fairness in salary, fairness in equality is sort of a way of talking about it. I think by now we all have learned, or most of us have learned, that equality is not the end all be all, right? That there's more to what we want to be doing than simple equality. We want to look at people as individuals and as communities and see what it is that they need and give people what they need. So we can move through that into equity and then beyond, right? Like we can be equitable today, but what does that mean for us historically, right? How can we actually repay the disadvantages that have impacted communities over generations, right? Through things like affirmative action, remediation, and reparations. So it's just to think about our values in a continuum and think about where we are now and think about how we can continue to improve on that. Go to the next slide, please. So then to go back to the personnel strategies a little bit, I wanted to get a little bit more specific about some of the personnel options, or particularly benefits options, that I think are really powerful. Go on to the next slide. Thanks, Kurt. Some things to think about around pay and benefits and personnel. Setting pay bands we think is really important. I have become an advocate of single salary pay for positions. So if there is a job, this is what it pays. And anybody who we hire to do this job is going to pay this amount. So we do not negotiate with people who work for us, but we also don't ever underpay people for work, right? So everybody who does a particular job at our company gets paid the same amount of money. And that is just a way of eliminating all of this confusion, disadvantaging of particular communities, and all these other problems that we can bring with pay. De-emphasizing seniority and credentials is really important for equity. We know that certain communities have not been given opportunities, right? And so their resumes, their work histories are going to look different because some folks had more opportunity than others. And also, frankly, it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the job is different. or that the kinds of tasks that we've assigned are different, right? So if we're assigning the same kinds of tasks, perhaps some folks are more junior and take a little bit longer to do that. That'll change, right? They'll get stronger at this work and they'll get faster at it over time. But they're doing the same kinds of work and they're doing about the same amount of volume. And so we think that having set pay bands is really helpful. Progressive PTO, I mentioned a little bit about the PTO structures that we have. I will add to that having really good, setting a really good example about how to use PTO is important. So we encourage people to take not just weekends, but long vacations, and to take then perhaps some shorter vacations, maybe a week long, and then to take some weekends. So we try to mirror that. We try to show that, right, as leaders. And then we also, for example, at Diverge, give people a summer week, right? So we know that that's the best time in Minnesota to take time off, and we want people to enjoy the sunshine and the weather. So we incentivize them by giving them an extra week that's only usable in the summer, right? To kind of see if we can get folks out of the office a little bit as well and balanced. And then beyond the basics of benefits, which is for us means, are you supporting medicine that's non-Western medicine, right? Body work, dance, yoga, right? What are the sorts of what are some kinds of important health benefits or practices that are really community specific, that are really important to a lot of folks that normally would not be supported by the benefits of an organization, and adding those into your policies beyond the traditional, medical or Western medicine type benefits. Go ahead, Kurt. And then again, we've mentioned about our pay bands. I think this is a reiteration of that, but essentially we want to make sure that pay ranges are public, that they're equal, that we don't keep people from being able to discuss their salaries, right? They should be able to discuss their salaries if they like, and then not asking for salary histories. I mean, it should not matter what somebody made at a previous job. It should matter what this job pays and what the value of this work is, right? So this comment, which is that it's harder to sustain discrimination when it's no longer a secret, is really powerful, right? If we take the veil off, right, then it's a lot easier for there to be the pay discrimination. Next slide, please. And then this is something that hopefully we are beyond at this point, at least for most of our organizations, but we saw during the pandemic all sorts of staffing cuts. And we've talked to folks about how to do that in different ways, right? Because oftentimes what we say is, well, we're going to let go of the most recent person who came in. Well, oftentimes those are our youngest folks, our people of color, right? A lot of disadvantaged communities, right? And so if we let go of the people who came in most recently, we're often disadvantaging them again. And so what are other options to do across the board cuts, right? You could do it by percentage, you could do it by hours. It tends to disproportionately affect lower salaried staff because they have the hardest time dealing with pay cuts, right? So you could also do progressive salary cuts where the largest cuts come from the people who make the most, right? That is something that has been a tradition a lot of other times where CEOs will cut their pay if they're laying people off, right? Or things like that. You can think about things that way too. But another way to think about this is to level salaries, right? So often what that means is to level salaries down to a certain level, right? Oftentimes to the lowest paid salary level. And that's a great lesson for all of us who are in higher pay, more senior jobs, to remember what it's like, right? To live off of the lowest salaries that we have in an organization. So it's both, I think, a values decision, but also really illuminating, right? About what we're asking our staff to do on a day-to-day basis. Go on to the next slide, please, Kurt. So go ahead, Curtis. Time for poll number 3.
It is. I think this one has a more reasonable number of choices to it, but we really do want to know if there any of the kinds of personnel compensation practices we mentioned. Oh, I take it back. I guess we had a few of these up there too. These might take a bit of reading, so we'll give you a chance to look at these. We'd love to know. There may be a lot of others that you put in the Q&A as well. We'd be curious to learn from one another in this context.
I do want to also share, because this is always such a hot topic, and it's finally moving, is my observation. You know, we're finally getting past some of these, or at least challenging some of our unquestioned assumptions about salary practice. Our June webinar is with a progressive consulting firm, Vega Mala. Somebody put a resource of theirs in the Q&A. They have a whole framework for establishing compensation that takes a reparations kind of mindset into account. So I think that'll be something to follow up with in June. Thank you for raising it here.
Great. Thanks, Jean.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, it's actually good to see that. And again, we're not trying to compare against like our survey population or anything like that to see how many people have done anything, but just looks like a good variety of folks have done some of these. And, you know, Luciano talked about that last one, the crisis one that we wish was past this. There will always be times when organizations are facing times of crisis. And we always get pressure to look at personnel first, because it's such a, normally for nonprofits, it's where we do our work, as our people are doing our work. But one of the things I would say, the spreadsheets are very telling when you do this work. We figured out very quickly that you could level your salaries and get the same 50% salary savings you would as if you laid off half of your staff, but yet everyone would still be there. And if these are supposedly short-term situations, wouldn't you rather have your whole staff ready to go again at the end of the crisis than to lay half of them off and keep everybody paid well at the top? So it's an interesting thing. It's like you have some tough decisions to make, but great information. So thank you for this. We do have actually time next for a Q&A. I don't know if anything else has rolled in that we could stop. Okay. Let's pause here just a minute.
You know, I think, thank you to everybody. As often happens in these rich discussions, people are talking to one another and offering resources to one another, and that's great. And thank you, presenters who aren't speaking, for chiming in. But I do want to raise this issue about crisis, because you just mentioned it, and it came up in terms of collaboration. Sounds exciting when resources are steady or flush, and then it sounds scary to talk about layoffs or budget cuts or staffing cuts in that same collaborative model. And I wonder, you know, if you have any just insights about that in terms of the support you've been providing to groups through the pandemic.
I can start with an example in my own history where I did it very poorly back in the day, where it was myself and the CEO cloistered away, choosing who was staying and who wasn't. And I actually have a lot of emotion about that experience, knowing that was just at the time I was new in my professional career. It seemed like the thing to do. You had the power. You were asked to do those things, sort of things. And that compared to what would it be like to actually go to the whole staff and say, here's where we stand. And how are we going to get through this, right? Now, I have actually had a better experience since then, where this was back in 2011 when the Minnesota state government shut down for a while, where the organization did some very temporary, very targeted furloughs, but we also did sort of rolling furloughs, like people would take off a few days each and go unpaid, but then they would come back. And then the next group would take a few days off each and come back. And it was a way to spread the burden of that. So we didn't furlough anyone entirely. So we actually kept 100 people employed when the government was shut down for a period that was, luckily it was temporary, but it was a much, much better experience. Thank
you. I often feel like we, not anyone in the chat, but me, since you said, I agree. Do you have this experience that somehow we're protecting people from something by protecting them from the full facts and context of a situation? And, all we have to do is pause as adults and say, is that how we want to be protected? Do we want to be assumed to be incapable of understanding the complexity of those choices? when our livelihood is at stake. So it's just a funny thing we do. The higher up we get, and then we set those habits that are almost kind of infantilizing, aren't they? And then, of course, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is some people don't feel accountability to the whole, so then they do react that way. So that is going to take time. But I always try to now go back to what would I want to know? Start there. I think we all want to understand the situation, right? As hard as it is. Yeah. Thanks for those questions. I think we should probably continue.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone. We'll have one more time to stop and pause here. I hope before the end. I'll try to make sure that we do. A few more pieces of the content, and some of this is actually just sort of like drawing attention to things we actually already put in sort of summary form earlier, but we're going to talk about vendor selection again, but I'm going to have a very specific example here in a second. But and I talked about it both when I was talking about this idea of going to different networks, right? Broadening your own network, looking in different places and rejecting some old ideas. This whole idea that the way you select vendors is look for the lowest cost. I mean, I know, I hope we've advanced beyond that, but sometimes we haven't. And boards can fall back into this false idea of what their fiduciary responsibilities are and sort of build these into policies and in ways that hamper us all. We came in, this is a great example. Shatu knows this one very well because this is an organization she's the CFO lead at. But we as a team had to advocate at the board level when a board was making a vendor decision. We watched some of the interplay that goes on here where boards and committees tend to think, oh, look, it's an emerging BIPOC organization that does this great work. Oh, well, here's the well-established long-term white organization. What if we get the white-led organization to take on the BIPOC-owned organization as a sub contractor for underneath this project? And that way we get, and maybe it was Luciano, I can't remember, it was Luciano Shatu had the experience of talking to this organization, and good for them. The BIPOC-led organization said, oh yeah, oh no, we're not going to be anybody's second. So either choose us or choose them. And to this organization's great credit, they choose the BIPOC-led organization. So that was a good experience. And also then supporting incubators that we know of. We have in our own area incubators for BIPOC and LGBTQ organizations that are great sources for emerging businesses we didn't even know existed yet, and tapping into them right away in vendor choices. I do want to talk really quickly that Luciano alluded to this earlier. There's a number of slides here, but they all sort of make a point that I think will hopefully be clear to you as we go through. We want to, why do we talk about investments as an important vendor choice? It's not only just the actual investments themselves. And this is, we think, oh, why talk about this for not all nonprofits have them? And yet foundations and nonprofits together, probably by now, over $2 trillion worth of the investment pool in the US. Enormous amount of collective impact there. So there's a reason that we talk about it. But it's really not just endowments, it's everything. It can be just your reserves. Where do you put your money? And we fall into this idea that for those of you who do have endowments or any kind of a reserve or even designated board money that you try to live in or at least take advantage of the distribution from it, we've fallen into this idea that because foundations, which are private foundations, have a legal reason why they're required to pay out 5% a year, somehow we think that's what that means. Oh, a wise practice is we pay out 5% of our endowment pool or investment pool every year. That is only for their tax purposes, and that is the minimum. That is not the maximum, and it's not in any way a gold standard. But it's often invested in mainstream options. Any of that money that is invested, the part that isn't paid out. And I always like to think of it this way. This is one of those places where I think that the 5% we see foundations paying out, the 5% that we pay out of our endowments, I would like to place that. We always think that's where our change is happening. That's where we're investing in change in the world. Compare that to the power of the 95% that if we haven't thought about it, if we haven't been intentional, we are investing in the status quo. I'm going to say that 95% is going to win out all the time as far as the value of that money. So we have to push ourselves. And there's been a great debate. I'm all for it. In the last couple of years with the pandemic, a lot of foundations have responded. Philanthropic groups, organizations have dug into their endowments, and they've paid out more. and they've doubled it in some ways, and they're very proud of the doubling. But this is actually a proportional diagram. Here's still what 5% plus 5% looks like versus 90%. So if you think about where this money is invested, again, is 10% really tipping the scales, right? And I know there's this idea of perpetuity that, oh, well, this is invested for, okay, great. I mean, there's been some, great memes out there about, sure, we'll give you one fire extinguisher every year to put out this 4-alarm fire in your building. It's way more important that we are here around, and instead of giving you all the things you need right now to solve the problem. So really, we're asking, if we're not foundations, if we're nonprofits, how do we address this issue? So we're just asking, and challenging, and we've had a lot of fun already challenging organizations. There's a couple of them we're working now with their investment committees, and it's a long process. People are very entrenched in returns and safety and, risk and all of those things, which sound like very important topics, but they are all worthy of challenge. So that we can actually start to see the collective impact of this. So we're asking the organizations we work, because we're now their leadership. We're their financial leadership. We're in the middle of the conversation. So we're getting to rub up against their finance committees and their CEOs. And we're just asking, where are you invested? Everything from who actually manages your investments. So we're talking about who are your philanthropic advisors. And frankly, we've been sort of daunted ourselves about who we've been able to find, at least in the Twin Cities area, where there are mostly very white owned and led organizations in the philanthropic investment investment pool sort of management. But it can come down to some of these things, just choice of your banking institution. Are you only investing in traditional stock and bond markets? Luciano, alluded to ESG. We're all sort of moving there. A lot, maybe personally we moved there, this environmental, social, and governance sort of screens for our investments, but that's just barely touching it. So we've started challenging people into other things like mission-aligned investment. What's it really look like? What would a direct community investment look like? Have you actually thought about investing in a local business? Or there are other groups, many of them nonprofits, like community development financial institutions. That's where I came from that world, the Propel world, Propel Nonprofit, NFF. There's all kinds of organizations out there that we're familiar with that actually are CDFIs that invest in communities. Calvert Fund, there's all kinds of places where we can pool our money, and that money gets invested directly in the communities we're most interested in serving and actually helping create a systemic change. And things as avant-garde, if you want to consider them as social impact ventures, where we're getting involved with other people. Pooling our resources is one way to address this. And as nonprofit organizations, we have a responsibility. We really are, along with foundations, holding in our investment pools $2 trillion worth of money that can be making an impact in the world. So that was the quick version I wanted to get through. There's a quick poll here, just about any of the financial investment options that your organization is using.
I really also think a secondary benefit of even changing your banking institution, even small things like this, the effect it can have on staff, especially in a time, I think, of kind of existential, ambivalence in a lot of places, a lot of organizations struggling along their own equity journey on relationships between frontline staff and executive staff and trust building. These steps towards walking the talk are very powerful, right? Even if they don't have huge financial implications, this alignment of our administrative choices, I think, is such an opportunity to create cohesion and accountability within the staff. I don't know if you've had that experience. I certainly did as an executive director. It's not always big money, but it's alignment. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share the results.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, obviously, and I also want to shout out to everybody who's been sharing in the Q&A. There's so many ways to address this and start to just take the first steps towards it, because that can start the conversation Jean was just alluding to. And Jean, it's been very heartening that we often get the most support from folks we wouldn't expect. The program staff love to see what we're up to. that we seem to align very quickly with their values. And so we're sort of helping become their advocates going up into some of the decision-making bodies, the finance committee.
You've done such a lovely job of raising up, you said it's not about the numbers. I mean, there's so many conversations that are implicit in all the opportunities you laid out today, whether it's vendor selection or investment policy, that you don't have to be a spreadsheet whiz to get meaningfully involved in. And as I said, then feel a sense of, I think, should you use the word ownership, right? In a good sense, like I feel an ownership of the organization's financial choices and alignment, right? And then you can start to push more maybe on their engagement and some of the tactical pieces around budgeting and so forth.
Wonderful. Well, I know that we tried to leave a little time here at the end. We may not quite have done that very well, especially given the number of responses in the Q&A, which again, thank you for all that. That's great to see. And I also love that the fact you're getting to chat with one another there.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I guess what I'd like to do is just invite any of the three of you who might want to leave a closing comment, even having heard and seen all of this reaction, just sort of a word of encouragement or what you see sort of coming next for folks. And you don't have to do that, but we'd love to have you do that as we close out.
I'll just say, I know you've heard a lot have been thrown at you today. Maybe some of these topics are exciting, and just reading the chat, I can see some of you trying, to get these implemented in your organization. And what I'll say is, it's not easy. These conversations are not sometimes easy to have with leaders. Even finding that vendor list that you want to impact is not always easy. It's not something you can just go to Google and find. And so it takes a lot of hard work. It takes a lot of commitment. And I just want to encourage you to just stay on it, basically. That's what I would encourage you, because sometimes it's easy to say, oh, I cannot find it, or I cannot find that CDF file that will do what I want it to do. So I'm just going to go to the traditional. It's easy to just put it off. But I will say, stay on it, collaborate. Work with other nonprofits who are trying to do the same things, and reach out. And sometimes you'll be amazed as to what can evolve just by starting the conversations, that there are different like-minded people trying to achieve the same things. And there's definitely power in collaboration. So I'll just encourage you to stay on it and do the right thing, because we know the impact that's going to have for us all and for this planet that we actually inhabit.
Luciano or Kurt, any parting words as we wrap here? Thank you, Shatu. That was very encouraging.
I'll just say I tried to get as many of your questions as I could in the question and answer section. I didn't get to all of them. Some really great ones still in there. Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll just have to, maybe we can get them later and we can get them sent out or something.
Yes, we can produce
We'd be
this.
happy to try to answer some more of these. I'm actually really curious how Kurt or Shatu would answer some of these, because I'm putting my super progressive spin on some of these answers. And I don't know if I've oversold some of those values, but in the end, it's been really great talking to you all. Really great questions. I'd really love a chance to continue the conversation, but we'll have to do it the next time.
Great. All right. Well, we'll wrap then, and I appreciate the three of you so much. Appreciate the work you're doing with individual organizations, but also to influence the infrastructure and who's being attracted into and supported in finance functions and organizations. So appreciate you so much. And I'll share with you all, I said it briefly earlier, but we're kind of on a finance run here for a couple of months in our leadership program. In May, we have our Mastering QuickBooks series. So if you or anyone on your team is a QuickBooks user, this is one of the best trainings I've ever seen. QuickBooks Made Easy and Nonprofit Quarterly partner once a year on a Mastering QuickBooks for Nonprofit series. So that's in May. And then in June, very apropos to this conversation, the wonderful Vega Mala team will be here to walk us through a very emergent compensation framework that they are building and consulting to clients around, that builds in questions of equity and reparation. So many of you may want to join us for that. Shatu, Kurt, Luciano, thank you for your work and thanks for being here.